Okay, so I think I ended the last part one of chapter 4, a little bit too early. I was looking at the next slides over, and I saw that kind of went into a little bit. It just things that I had already stated, but here it's written actually out for you on the slide. So just to reiterate, you have two cells, right? Prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells make up bacteria and archaea, and then eukaryotic cells make up things like animals, plants, fungi, and even protists. So it should say here grouped as 4 kingdoms. I know that's against what your book says, but it's grouped as 4 kingdoms because these 4 kingdoms, including the protists, fall under the eukarya domain. There's lots of variety when it comes to eukaryotic cells, and they have these organelles. And I didn't read this before, but I want to kind of read and define what organelles actually are. So an organelle is a highly organized structure internal to the cell that serve some sort of specialized function. Okay, so there's a variety of different things. So when we look at the eukaryotic in general, or the eukaryotic cell in general, we find a nucleus, which is that organelle, the membrane-bound organelle that stores DNA. We have other organelles outside the nucleus. We have the cytosol. This is just the jelly-like fluid in which the cell's organisms are immersed. We find the same kind of cytosol, that jelly-like fluid, with bacteria. We have a cytoskeleton, which we'll get into a little bit later on, but this is basically, it provides scaffolding and structure to the cell so that it's not just a melted cell that's kind of like sprawled all over the environment. The plasma membrane, and then of course the cytoplasm, which is just that region that the region that has the cytosol, the region of the cell inside the plasma membrane, but outside of the nucleus. Okay, so we're going to go into these different kinds of features into a little bit more detail. We'll start with the membrane, right, with the plasma membrane. Then we'll keep going a little bit on the outside, on the cell surfaces a little bit more. And then we'll proceed to things like the nucleus, and then other organelles like ribosomes, and endoplasmic reticulum, etc. So that's basically the order of things. However, when we go into the membrane, even though this comes right after eukaryotes, now that we're talking about the membrane, don't think that bacteria and archaea, and therefore prokaryotic cells, don't have a membrane. They actually do, right? So they have a plasma cell membrane. Every single cell has a plasma cell membrane. If we go back to that slide that lists the features that are shared with every single cell, right? We have the plasma membrane is one of the features, including, and then the cytosol and the chromosomes and ribosomes. So we're going to go into the actual structure of the plasma membrane, because again, remember, I know I keep saying this so many times, but we have to figure out the structure of something in biology in order to actually understand its function. So the plasma membrane, much like other membranes, but is different because the plasma membrane interacts with the outside. Okay, it's the boundary that separates the living cell from its non-living surroundings and regulates the traffic of chemicals in and out of the cell. So remember, we have that selective barrier that allows certain things to go in, like nutrients, oxygen, minerals, whatever good things the cell needs, and then things to go out. So various toxins to go out, various wastes, various like cell communication signals that need to leave the cell. They sometimes have to go out of the plasma membrane. So it keeps some substances in and some substances out. So what do we call this characteristic of keeping some things in and out? It's known to be semi-permeable. You're going to be hearing this a lot. It's a semi-permeable membrane. Semi means half. So half permeable to some things and not permeable to other things. So it's permeable to water and lipid substances, but it's not permeable to larger substances that carry a charge. Okay, so the reason why it's semi-permeable is actually because of its structure. See, this is the reason why we look at structure to figure out how it works. The reason why it can select things like water and lipids can go through, but bigger things like proteins can't, is because of its structure. And the structure of the plasma membrane, and it's basically composed of phospholipids. We went over phospholipids already. Really important lipid, right? It's a really important category. Phospholipids, if you remember, have a dual nature, meaning part of them are hydrophobic. They don't like the water. They're water fearing. And part of them are hydrophilic. And so they're water loving. Okay, so I'm going to So if we have here a phospholipid, we have the phosphate head, okay, so phosphate head, and then we have two fatty acids, these two fatty acid tails just kind of coming out. And so this part here of with the fatty acids is hydrophobic because they're fatty acids, there's those hydrocarbon chains that do not like water. And then the phosphate group is itself charged, it's actually negatively charged, right? And so because it's charged, it can interact with water molecules because water molecules, remember, have that partial distribution where the oxygen, this is the two hydrogen ears, I made them really tiny, okay? But the oxygen is negative and the hydrogen ears are partially positive. Remember that weird little delta sign. So because of the unequal distribution of charges on a water molecules really like charged stuff. And so since the phosphate is charged, it's negatively charged, the phosphate is hydrophilic. So we have that dual nature, okay, dual nature of phospholipids. This is perfect for the membrane because imagine you have millions and millions of these guys, and you know that cells, basically the thing that you find the most in a cell, I guess, and outside a cell is water. We're basically 75 to 80% water. And so because the phospholipids, imagine there's millions of them, they're all surrounded by water, they're going to kind of self-assemble in a very specific way. They do it in such a way that the phosphate heads are the only ones that are touching the water. If you see here, I'm gonna make the water blue. This is the water. We want the phosphate heads to be touching the water only. Okay, so they're probably gonna arrange here. But then you might say, okay, Alessia, these phosphate heads are touching, but these fatty acids, which are hydrophobic, are now touching this side of the water. What do we do? What would happen is fatty acids, the other phospholipids, remember there's millions of them, would arrange themselves so that they form a layer opposite of this first layer right here. And so you see we have phosphate heads that are touching the water, and these fatty acids are basically found in the middle. And this continues until you form a complete circle. And so as you form this circle, so if you see, I'm going to do a terrible job drawing it, but so I pause the video to draw it. But these are basically all the phospholipids. As you can see, the little heads, these little circles, are all the phosphates, and they're basically the ones that are pointing inside of the cell, which is perfect because inside the cell we have an aqueous solution. So we have agua, water. We have water inside the cell, right? And so only the hydrophilic part of the phospholipids wants to be touching the water. The hydrophobic part, as you can see, is basically in the middle, and I know I didn't draw it incredibly well, okay? They're all completely tightly packed so that no water molecule can go in. No water molecule can go in, which is great because that means that the fatty acids, which are hydrophobic, are not in contact with water. And then outside of the cell, we have some more water, right? Because cells are also are basically, in our bodies, and our bodies have a lot of water. And so this is perfect again, this arrangement, because the phosphate heads are the only ones that are touching the water, and the fatty acids, which are hydrophobic, are not. And so because of this arrangement, I'm going to go back to sharing the screen because it's done in a better way. Because of this arrangement, you can see here phosphates are touching the water, phosphate heads are touching the water, and the fatty acids are ensconced and hidden within the actual inside, right? So they're basically not touching the water. Because of this, they can end up just forming what we call the membrane, right? So the plasma membrane is literally these phospholipids arranged in such a way. And we call this, so you can see phospholipids on this one side, all facing the inside of the cell, phospholipids on the other side, basically going all around, all facing the outside of the cell. And it goes for the entirety of, like it's 3D, right? The entirety of the cell. And this forms the plasma membrane. And so we say this because there's literally two layers of phospholipids. We have the first layer, right? And then the second layer. We have two layers of phospholipids. You can see it better in this picture right here. One layer on top, second layer at the bottom. One layer on top, second layer at the bottom. because we have this, we call the plasma membrane, it has a phospholipid bilayer, bi meaning two. So it has two layers of what molecule makes up the plasma membrane? The phospholipids. So it has a phospholipid bilayer. So this is the chief component of the plasma membrane, composed of two layers of phospholipids arranged with their fatty acids towards each other, towards the middle, away from the water. So the phospholipid head, which is hydrophilic, are arranged to face the aqueous solutions on both sides of the membrane, one inside the cell and one outside the cell. The phospholipid tails, which are your fatty acids, they're hydrophobic. They're arranged inward, shielded from water, and that's interior of the cell. Therefore, the interior of the cell membrane is hydrophobic. So in order for something to go through the actual plasma membrane, it needs to be hydrophobic because it needs to enter this crazy zone of hydrophobicity. Do you see that? There's literally, like, all the fatty acids, they form this barrier, this hydrophobic barrier. You can see it a little bit clearer in this picture right here. This yellow part, that's a hydrophobic barrier, right? So for things to go in and out, they also have to be hydrophobic. If something is hydrophilic, if something is like, there's a molecule that wants to go inside the cell and it's hydrophilic, yeah, it'll get past the actual heads because they're kind of like slippery. But then if it basically comes to this really crazy hydrophobic barrier, and it's not going to be able to go through, right? So this is the reason why we have semi-permeability, because of this hydrophobic zone, this hydrophobic region. Another thing about the phospholipid bilayer is that it gives fluidity to the membrane. This is something that a lot of students cannot really completely grasp. They look at the picture and they kind of think of it as being a very solid structure. Don't forget, like, lipids can be in liquid format, right? Remember, oils, and that's actually what phospholipids really are. It's like that oil. Okay, so if it helps you remember, you know that when you put a drop of oil in water, it literally forms a little bit of a bubble or a little vesicle. So it kind of forms a plasma membrane of its own. Basically, that's what's happening here with the phospholipids, right? It is still that liquidy kind of, it's very fluid. It's not solid. It's not static in any way. And so we call the plasma membrane, with a model that we use to call it, we call it a fluid model, right? Because it's molecules, like, since it's kind of liquidy, molecules can go in and out. If it was solid, nothing would be able to go in and nothing will be able to go out. So it's fluid, and therefore molecule can move, like, go in and out. In fact, molecules found within the plasma membrane, you see here, the plasma membrane isn't just made out of phospholipids. Like, that's the reason why we have a plasma membrane, but we can also add specific proteins to it, right? Different proteins, different things to make the cell specific. We just have things jutting out and, kind of embedded within the plasma membrane. And so these things aren't necessarily static, meaning they're not necessarily immobile. They can actually move through and kind of like travel, like, across the plasma membrane, just switching places wherever. So it's fluid because molecules can move freely past one another. Most phospholipids and some proteins can drift through the membrane as well. We also call it mosaic because it's just a bunch of different things that make it, right? Just like any kind of mosaic, like art piece. There's a variety of different components. So the main components is the phospholipids, but then, as we just saw, there's different proteins that can be kind of like squished in to the plasma membrane, right? So it's mosaic because of the diversity of proteins in the membrane. We have both stationary and mobile proteins here. The inner hydrophobicity, so this area right here, right, this inner hydrophobic region, allows only hydrophobic substances in, or really small hydrophilic substances in. Other more like charged, like bigger substances, hydrophilic substances, are like a little bit bigger, just like charged, like ions or polar substances or amino acids or whatever. These cannot go through the plasma membrane by themselves. They need help, right? So they cannot just go through the plasma membrane by themselves. And I believe we're going to go over how things travel through and across the plasma membrane in chapter 5, so in the next unit. So what's the plasma membrane composed of? Predominantly phospholipids, and then kind of dispersed within the phospholipids, we find, a variety of proteins and everything. So you can see here, this is a phospholipid bilayer. This is a plasma membrane, and you see you have all sorts of proteins and receptors embedded within it. So moving on to other structures found on the cell surface. So sometimes sometimes surrounding the plasma membrane, we can have a cell wall, okay? Not we, as in humans, actually that's completely wrong, but eukaryotic cells may have a cell wall. Only certain eukaryotic cells have a cell wall. Plant cells have cell walls, okay? Bacteria, which I know are prokaryotic, they have cell walls as well. We kind of looked at those already. Protists and fungi, which are eukaryotic, they can have, protists not always, but sometimes they usually do. Protists and fungi also have a cell wall. Animals do not have a cell wall, okay? Otherwise, things would be literally too rigid and inflexible. One thing I like to say is, if I don't know if I don't like saying this without actually seeing you guys, but you probably have watched Guardians of the Galaxy, right? Okay. Obviously, it's a fictional storyline, but it is extremely fun to watch. So if you haven't watched it, I highly suggest you guys go ahead and watch it. Okay. Now, you may know the character Groot. He's this little tree animal thingy. He's like a little talking alive tree or plant thing, and he's obviously very rigid. He's got, like, you know, he looks like a plant. He's very rigid and just like structured and just kind of stem-y looking. The reason why plants, and in this fictional case, Groot is like stemmy looking and like kind of structured, is because they have cell walls around their cell membrane. So if I was to draw a cell, a plant cell, I would draw it like this. It's a eukaryote. So here I go. I'm making all sorts of my you know, like organelles, and then around the plasma membrane, I would put another barrier, making it a little bit more rigid looking, called the cell wall. And you kind of see this as well in the actual image here in the PowerPoint. You have a plasma membrane, right? And then around it, you have this darker kind of brownish structure, at least it's depicted brown in this picture, and that's basically the cell wall. So if animals had a cell wall, which thankfully we do not, we would all look like Groot. Okay, we would all look like really weird structure, like not like scary, but just very bark-y. Okay, so we do not have a cell wall. Plants do, fungi do, certain protists do. Okay, so those are the eukaryotic cells can have a cell wall, but only specific kinds, only if they belong to a specific kingdom. Animal cells, we are made out of eukaryotic cells, but we do not have a cell wall. And then, of course, there's prokaryotic cells, which do have a cell wall. Most of them do. Bacteria and archaea do have different variations of cell walls. Okay, so what is this cell wall? This cell wall is just an extra outer protective lining in plants and fungi and bacteria and protists. So it's just an extra outer protective barrier. So the plasma membrane is usually very thin, and the cell wall is quite thick, right? You can see the thickness of the cell wall in the picture as well. What roles does it have? It's important for structural strength. It puts a limit of water absorption. We'll see that a little bit later on, but basically this is why plants can take in so much water without bursting. If we took in the same amount of water that plants did, our cells would burst, which is terrifying. Your cells would just implode. It protects the plants from harmful outside influences. So remember, it's basically a wall, right? It's a protective barrier. The wall gives structure, the wall gives protection. There's also channels through the actual cell wall, right? And this allows for communications between adjoining cells. So you don't see it here, but should be another cell right here, another plant cell right here. And so because of these channels that go through the cell, they're called plasmodesmata. You don't need to know the name, but I just want to tell you that it is actually depicted in this picture. Through these channels, one cell can communicate with its neighboring cell, because these channels go through the actual cell membrane. Sorry, the cell membrane and the cell wall. Okay, it's composed of cellulose and lignin. We talked about cellulose already, right? Remember, it's that polysaccharide that denotes the structure to plants, right? And strength to plants. The reason it gives strength and stability and structure to plants is because it is the main constituent of cell walls. So the cell walls of plants are made out of cellulose. Okay, the cell walls of things like protists and bacteria are made out of slightly different kinds of polysaccharides, but you don't need to know them at all, so don't worry about them. Okay, the cell wall also has different functions over an organism's life. yeah, different functions over an organism's life. Generally, it's a site of a lot of metabolic activities, not merely just a barrier. There's a lot of things that are happening. Remember, we have those channels. And as the plant, basically, as the cell wall dies, right, because it does have its own lifespan type of thing. As the cell wall dies, it basically helps form things like tree bark. So tree bark cell wall is dead and acts as a barrier function. So it has different functions over the organism's life, depending on, you know, if the organism is young, that's usually where we have a lot of metabolic activity in the cell wall. If the organism is like matured and growing, and like a tree is matured and growing, we now start having like a tree bark, tree trunk. And so the cell wall here is dead and acts as a barrier function. Okay, so these are membrane structures. Other cells are like, in addition to the plasma membrane, certain eukaryotic cells and most prokaryotic cells have a cell wall. What eukaryotic cells do not have a cell wall? Animals. You are not Groot. As much as we all want to be Groot, we can't be Groot. Okay, so another thing that we have to consider is the fact that since animal cells lack a cell wall, what exactly do we have that's kind of like protecting us a little bit? Excuse me. What exactly do we have that's kind of protecting our cells a little bit? So our cells are basically covered. So animal cells, okay, note here animal, I'm going to underline it. Our cells are covered by an elaborate extracellular matrix, or the ECM. This extracellular matrix is absolutely incredible. It's basically like this molecular net, right? It's a net that holds all of our cells together so they don't go wandering off, right? So all of our cells are anchored. This is really important, right? We want our cells to be anchored. In fact, actually, kind of like going off on a tangent, but one of the things about cancer, you may have heard that if a person has cancer, say they have lung cancer, that cancer could then spread and become something else, like another kind of cancer, right? The reason why cancer spreads is because the cells have lost their anchorage. And so cells start moving around in the body. That should not happen, right? You want your lung cells to stay in your lungs. You want your liver cells to stay in your liver and only there. You don't want anything to wander around. And so the reason why this is possible is because of the extracellular matrix. And yes, in cancer, in like really malignant bad cancers, cells starts kind of moving around and away from, kind of, they detach themselves from this extracellular matrix, this net that holds all the cells together. So the extracellular matrix is basically a net made out of these fibers of proteins and a lot of collagen, right? A lot of collagen. We've talked about this protein before. It holds the cells together in tissues. It also has protective and supportive functions as well. In addition, we have cell-to-cell communication as well. So our cells can be like, you know, like attached to one another. So most animal cell surfaces have cell junctions. These are structures that connect cells together into tissues and allow the cells to function in a coordinated way. So that we kind of have these little junctions that attach like animal cells together, and then they help us communicate with our neighboring cells. So neighboring cells in tissues, organs, or organ systems often adhere, interact, and communicate through direct physical contact thanks to these cell junctions. Okay, so if I was to draw it, you know, since my drawing abilities are amazing, I don't know if you guys have noticed yet, but I'm not a very good artist. It's actually really funny because I come from my whole family are artists, and I'm like the only one who just doesn't do anything. So we have this, basically these fibers are intertwined and they form a nice net, right? A net so that our cells, so this is the extracellular matrix, this net, and then our cells can basically be stuck to this net, and it basically helps them, gives them kind of like a protective barrier. It gives them like a protective barrier, and it gives them also like a place for them to stay. It gives them support, right? It gives them anchorage, like it allows them to stay in one place. And so our cells basically are like this, and you can see sometimes our cells connect, right? Which is good, which is great. We want our cells to basically be next to each other. And so these connections are basically helped out by cell junctions, called cell junctions. So our cells basically stick together, which basically, I keep saying basically, I'm sorry, but it increases the fact that all the cells stay in one place and they're all anchored in one area, because they're not only are they put in the extracellular matrix, but they're also connected to each other, and they can also help like communicate with each other, right? So this is what we have with animals. Plants and fungi, they do not have this extracellular matrix. They don't have these cell junction or anything like that. So this is where I'm going to end part 2, and I shall see you guys in the next video in part 3. Part 3, we're going to start talking about actual organelles, right? Actual organelles that we find in eukarya. So remember, the plasma membrane we find in bacteria, so in archaea and eukarya domain, so prokaryotes and eukaryotic cells. We talked about the cell wall a little bit, which is found in most prokaryotes and only in certain eukaryotic cells. And then we looked at the cells, the animal cells that lack the cell wall, what they have instead. They have the extracellular matrix and these cell junctions. Right, so I shall see you guys in the next video.